experience I got in the Marine Corps is probably what pushed me into acting.
The Marine Corps pushed you into acting?
Yeah, well, I worked for the Armed Forces Radio.
Did you always want to be an actor?
Well, I did secretly. I didn't want to tell anybody because I was ashamed. I thought maybe that was...
There is some anger in me that I'm able to touch on that gives us maybe a sense of danger or something at times.
A secret letter hidden for 15 years, a Hollywood legend who vanished into the desert, and a chilling prophecy that haunted him to his final days. Gene Hackman's last words weren't a farewell. They were a terrifying confession. What was he running from? And why did he know how his story would end? This is the truth Hollywood never wanted you to see. The newly unearthed final letter. Gene Hackman's trembling words expose a terrifying truth. Not a letter of gratitude, not a missive to fans. This is a cold-blooded indictment Gene Hackman wrote about himself. A man who spent his life running from applause, only to realize his most persistent pursuer was the ghost named Gene Hackman. For the first and last time, he screamed out all the untold secrets that letter not only shocked fans, it tore apart the legend's facade laid bare. A scarred soul and dragged us all into the hell where Gene Hackman was trapped. Read on if you dare to look into the darkness. Named Gene Hackman. Chapter 1. The man who walked away from Hollywood one day. Gene Hackman walked out of Hollywood like someone who had completed their final mission, without looking back, without leaving any clear traces behind. He did not announce it to the media. There was no exclusive interview explaining his reasons, nor was there a grand farewell with the colleagues who had once dominated the screen with him. People only realized he had left when the 2005 event invitations kept returning. With a short note relayed by his personal assistant, Mr. Hackman declines. There were no further explanations. Beverly Hills was where he had lived for almost 3 decades, from his time as a struggling young actor to get supporting roles to the times he held an Oscar in his hand. The house on the hillside where he jogged every morning and sat with a cigar every night, gazing down at the neon city, was suddenly placed on sale. Unexpectedly, a young couple purchased that house, entirely unaware that every wall there had seen every emotion of a legend. Santa Fe, New Mexico, where Gene Hackman selected his last stop to. Many was just a barren land covered in desert dust with nothing but bald hills and a sunburnt sky. But to Gene, it was where he felt most at ease. No paparazzi, no persistent producers calling, not even fans waiting at the door for an autograph. Hackman and Betsy Arakawa, the woman who brought him from the vibrant world to this quiet land, selected a small house hidden behind cacti and rocks. The ghost in the desert, that's how the neighbors here spoke of Gene Hackman. A name they didn't dare utter. Allowed a figure they hardly saw in real life. Only heard the engine of his old pickup truck every morning, driving by the sandy dirt road. Gene hardly talked to anyone but Betsy. Once an old man living a few miles away reminisced. He sat on the porch, his eyes staring far into the sunset. I don't know what he was thinking, but he seemed to be waiting for something. What could make an American film icon who had ruled Hollywood choose to live so quietly? Jen rarely spoke of his fears. In an old interview, long before he retired, "I don't want to die under a flashbulb." That sentence was like a prophecy. He wasn't afraid of the end, something everyone would face, but he was afraid of that moment being recorded, scrutinized, turned into a sensational news item in tabloids. Betsy Arakawa, the companion who accompanied John for many years, told an old friend that Hackman never spoke of fame. He didn't turn on the TV, didn't watch any of his own films. Old photos from his youth, the day he stood on the Oscar stage, the day he took pictures with Marlon Brando or Lucino, were all stored in cardboard boxes locked in the basement. He wanted to forget, not because of regret, but because he felt part of his soul belonged there, and he needed to reclaim what was left for himself. The friend reminisced. Gene Hackman's silence was not oblivion. It was an active choice, a way to safeguard the last precious things, left privacy, freedom, in a small corner where he could sit with the woman he loved quietly. Intuition sometimes whispers in those days. Did Gene Hackman hear any calls echoing in the desert wind? Chapter 2. Whispers from a dying legend in the summer of 2011. Among the harsh, dry heat characteristic of Santa Fe, Gene Hackman sat on his weathered gray wooden porch, consenting to an interview with GQ magazine. It was a rare moment when he let outsiders into his world, which had been closed for many years. The tape recorder lay on the table. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood from the old fireplace, and Hackman, with eyes that combined calmness and melancholy, started to speak about something nobody expected: the end. I dream about my own death more often than I should. He said, his voice horror, as if every word had to be unearthed from the deepest parts of his memory. A legendary actor who had become immortal icons on screen now sat there discussing his own end, as if it were a given, or worse, as if it were within reach. He could touch it for a long time. The industry had attempted to revive Hackman. Francis Ford Coppola, who had initiated the conversation, sent him a 3-handwritten letter, passionately calling him back to appear in a final work, a role tailor-made for Gene himself. Clint Eastwood, his old buddy from the same generation, even drove to Santa Fe just to have a bourbon with Hackman, hoping the booze could soften his heart. But Hackman rebuffed them all, not because he despised cinema, but because he knew some doors had been closed and opening them again would only make what was inside spoil faster. Gene Hackman lived his last years like a legend, wiping his name off history. But no matter how hard he tried, peculiar thoughts about the end still intruded, clinging to him. The first evidence emerged in 2018, a handwritten letter sent to Dustin Hoffman, his old buddy who had shared his difficult early years in New York. Nobody knew about that letter until everything was over, when Dustin brought it to light. Hackman's shaking handwriting became the first piece disclosing his complicated psychological portrait in his last years. If someday I vanish, remember I was content, but not always. A peculiar message, both light and heavy. Was it a goodbye, a confession, or the faraway echo of a soul that had climbed to the top, now moved towards the shadows? The close ones to Hackman knew he was not the kind to say easily such things during his life. He lived for an iron regimen, concealing all personal hurts behind layers of irony and brutality. But in this letter, Hackman unveiled his most fragile side. For the first time, a man who had everything, but in the end feared his own life. Betsy Arakawa, his wife that had lived with him all ups and downs, also confessed something to a close friend. Some nights Gene does not sleep. He sits on the window peering into the darkness. Quiet end for hours, I do not ask, because I know there are storms in his heart that I will never reach the appearance of the letters. The bizarre dreams, the mornings Hackman cycled around town, then halted long-standing in front of the little cemetery in the corner, all seem quiet signs that only the discerning would recognize. Gene Hackman was not afraid of dying. The only thing that worried him perhaps was the compulsion to be forgotten, or worse, remembered in a distorted, deformed manner, something he hated his entire life. The letter to Dustin Hoffman, later put in a small glass frame in Hoffman's house, was like a final memento of a friendship that had lasted more than half a century. If someday I vanish. Perhaps Gene Hackman never really vanished. He just retired slowly, disappearing into the desert. Twilight letting his last whispers echo, like the whispers of a dying legend. Chapter 3, the letter that should not be there. At the beginning of January 2024, when the name Gene Hackman had almost been erased by Hollywood media, a sudden earthquake hit from the most unexpected location. His old office, or the little room in Santa Fe where, for more than 10 years, only the harsh desert sun had paid a visit to the instigator of it all, was a man believed to have vanished from Hackman's life years ago. His former personal assistant. This man, unnamed at his request, suddenly contacted an old journalist with news that even the most experienced news hounds couldn't believe. Gene Hackman left a top-secret letter in hiding for over 15 years, whose existence no one knew about, including Betsy Arakawa. The old envelope, its edges yellowed by age, was discovered in the bottom drawer of the oak desk Gene Hackman wrote on, every day on the front, in firm, neat letters, but shaky at the end. He left a message for those who care when I'm no longer here. Just a few words, but each word cut into the silent space of the dusty room. Like a knife, those close to John knew he was not a man to easily reveal emotions, much less the kind of artist who enjoyed showing off his private thoughts. Yet in that envelope, Gene Hackman's most intimate, deepest voice was carefully wrapped package, waiting for a day to be revealed when the letter was opened. The first thing that gave everyone the chills was the handwriting. It was definitely Gene's. Each letter leaning a bit to the right, the commas set a bit off from grammatical standards. Just like the handwritten letters he sent to Dustin Hoffman or CPPA. Not a forgery, not a fake letter. This was Gene Hackman's last confession, something he hadn't had the courage to say. Even when he was alive, the letter was almost 3 pages long, without a flowery introduction, without any tearful goodbyes. Gene began straight to the point as he had lived to state what end Gene was referring to. But the next paragraph slowly unveiled an untold secret. He narrated a night in 1956 when he was an unknown young man working in a small roadside diner that night while cleaning the kitchen. Gene heard a voice behind him, not a customer, not a colleague, but his own voice echoing from somewhere Gene couldn't locate. It was me, but older, much older, and he said, "You won't die in Hollywood. You'll disappear in the desert." Gene claimed that from that moment, he had lived as someone fleeing from his own destiny. Every role, every award, every time he stood on the Oscar podium, none of it could erase that sentence. It haunted John throughout his peak years, and the older he became, the more he believed that voice wasn't an illusion. It was a call from another Gene Hackman, a version that knew the end, that the present Gene had to bear. The letter concluded with a single sentence like an omen. "When I'm no longer here, you'll finally understand why I left the day the letter was released." Hollywood was shaken, fans were stunned. No one fully comprehended the message Gene Hackman left, but everyone felt he had borne a secret, a truth too much for a human to bear, even if it was Gene Hackman, the one who had played immortal legends. And so Gene Hackman, though he had silently departed this world, still left an unanswered question, a question that haunted even those who dared to read his final letter. Chapter 4. A love story in the shadows amidst the pages of letters filled with memories and obsessions. The name that occurred most frequently was not any Hollywood icon, not CPPA, not Clint Eastwood, nor Robert Duvall or Dustin Hoffman, but Betsy Arakawa. The woman who didn't accompany Gene Hackman from his youth, didn't stand behind his first Oscar glory, but was the only one who dared to enter the deepest shadows of his soul, where even John himself hesitated to turn. Betsy was not a star, not a glamorous beauty appearing on red carpets, nor the type of woman who would mingle at power parties in Beverly Hills. When G met Betsy, she was a quiet piano artist who liked to read more than talk, and maybe it was that serenity, that gentle but unbending demeanor, that drew Gene out of the whirlwind of fame he had once believed he could never escape. In the letter Gene wrote of Betsy, in shaking words, both deeply loving and faintly fearful, "She's the only one who knows who I really am." Betsy was not merely a wife, a partner, but also the guardian of his last secret. The only one permitted to see Gene Hackman behind the mask of a film legend. He referred to her as "my last sanctuary," the last stronghold in the great desert where Gene did not have to play any role, did not have to strain under the flashlights, did not have to smile at those he did not trust. They opted for Santa Fe, not because they adored the desert landscape, nor because John needed a quiet retirement. Place Santa Fe was Betsy's choice, a place distant enough that no one would find them quiet enough for Gene to live fully with himself, without dreading the call from the past. It was Betsy who proposed that Gene sell the house in Beverly Hills, decline all comeback invitations, and step by step lead him out of the limelight he both longed for and dreaded. Gene acknowledged that without Betsy, he may never have found the courage to step out of his Hollywood persona. He had been afraid that if he stood too long in the spotlight one day, he would no longer recognize himself anymore. And Gene knew that temptation's power pits were already under every red carpet step, just one slip, and he would slide like so many other legends. But apart from the fear of fame, Gene bore another obsession, the obsession of losing Betsy. The letter kept repeating the anxiety that crept in each morning when John opened his eyes and knew he was still with her. He was afraid that one day Betsy would leave first, leaving him alone in the great desert, where no one had the patience to listen to his nightmares, his lifelong obsessions. If one day Betsy is no longer here, I will have no reason to stay. That sentence was not merely a late declaration of love from a man to his wife, but Gene's last word on his relationship to this world. To John Hackman, Betsy was not merely love, but the only thread holding him in reality without Betsy. Gene knew that the doors he had attempted to close, the doors leading to the past, to dark dreams, to the ghost foretelling his fate, would all burst open. The journey of two outlaws resting on each other, loving each other in the darkness, and their love never stopped shivering. Chapter 5. The fear that became a prophecy for half a century, playing all kinds of roles on screen, from tough cops, rugged men to cold villains. Gene Hackman always had a hard exterior, as if nothing could ever move him. But that was only the armor he wore in front of the camera, behind that rough exterior. There was always a bubbling obsession, a fear that crept in from the times Gene was a 13-year-old boy, frozen on the porch when he was told that his father had decided to end his life. The shadow of his father, a man who quietly walked out of Gene's life without a goodbye, never stopped haunting Gene in the pages of letters written after Jay left this world. He wrote, "There's a curse running through Hackman bloodline, a haunting curse. Hackman men all die alone, or shut the door of life with their own hands." June never spoke about that curse publicly, but it was the dark background music played throughout his life, even when fame was all around him. Awards lined the shelves. Gene Hackman always sensed something intangible trailing behind him, as if someone continually whispered in his ear of inevitable doom. He once confided in a few close friends of recurring dreams, in which June found himself in a wide expanse of desert alone, without Betsy, without anyone but sand and wind, and his father's horror voice calling from far away. That dream consumed Jean so much that even in his most triumphant years, he always declined any role with men who destroyed themselves. In the letter, Jean didn't outright confess that he had faith in the supernatural or destiny's design, but between the shaking lines he left an image that ran shivers down the reader's spine. Jean described a winter afternoon in 2008 when he stood in the window of his Santa Fe home and looked out at the vast expanse of desert. In that instant, June felt an icy air wrapped around him, colder than the desert winds. And then he heard someone call his name. The voice was hoarse, wearily tired, but so familiar that Jean shuddered. It was his father's voice who had abandoned Jean when Jean was a boy. That moment did not pass. Jean turned around. The house was vacant except for Betty, sitting reading a book by the fire. But from that instant, Jean knew he sensed the presence of something very close, very tangible. "I don't know how it will come, but I will know when it's near the line." Jean left was as if he wrote a prophecy for himself. He wasn't sure what day it would be, but Jean knew he would sense the cold breath of fate standing behind him. The Hackman family curse was no family legend, but to Jean became the blueprint for every decision in his life. He slowed down, left Hollywood at his prime. Not because he grew weary of acting, but because G believed that if he kept standing in the spotlight, he would no longer be able to discern the lines separating himself and the characters he portrayed. Jean feared he would become one of the tragedies he portrayed, the lonely lost ones consumed by the demons in their minds. The letter concluded with a brief line, but as chilling as an echo at night in the desert. "If you're reading this, I'm already part of the desert wind." Not a flowery farewell, not an emotional letter, but a cold prophecy, as if Gene Hackman knew his demise, knew that one day when the desert sand erased his footprints, all that would remain would be wind, sand, and the mysterious Hackman family curses. Chapter 6, Lost, Found, and Forever Remembered, when the old envelope, with the shaking words "for those who care, when I'm no longer here," was made public. Hollywood fell silent. Veteran actors who had shared the screen with G. Hackman, from Robert Duvall, Al Pacino to Dustin Hoffman, couldn't conceal their shock. People had believed Gene Hackman had quietly ended his life in Santa Fe, like an old warrior sheathing his sword after decades of roaming. But behind the door of the house, in the desert, behind the walls that kept Joan from the world, was a soul that had never found full peace. That letter wasn't long, but every sentence was a slice revealing the wild inner world of a legend. One who had trod through the spotlight, striding between the limits of light and darkness. During his career, Gene Hackman had been staged as a figure of tough men, wild souls prepared to shatter all barriers. But after all, fans learned that the strong man was a man himself who knew fear. Fear of what was out of control, fear of his own mind. In the letter, Jean not only wrote of death, but also of vanishing something that tormented him more than all the loneliness of a man who had lived his life in front of the camera, but wasn't sure who he really was. When the lights went out, the final letter became the strangest will of Hollywood. Not a career summary, not a sweet message to loved ones, but a naked slice of confusion where Gene Hackman confronted himself. No roles, no scripts, no directors. It was the first and last time Gene Hackman was honest with Gene Hackman. That letter also revealed his deep-seated fears, the fear of the family curse, the fear of being dragged into the lonely darkness. Like his father in the past, from a boy hiding behind a door, watching his father's shadow fade to an old man sitting quietly in the desert. Writing the last lines for himself, now Gene Hackman never really escaped that fate. He ran away by acting by becoming dozens of other people. But in the end, the only person Gene couldn't become was the real Gene Hackman. What sent chills down fans' spines the most was the final prophecy in the letter. If you're reading this, I'm already part of the desert wind. No one knew when John wrote that line, nor did anyone know if he had a premonition of his departure. But when the letter was discovered, he had really dissolved into the wind, becoming part of the New Mexico desert where G. Hackman had once been lost, had been found, and now was forever remembered. That letter didn't document achievements, didn't speak of 2 Oscars, didn't speak of classic films. Gene Hackman only left a piece of his soul, a nameless sadness, and the naked truth even the greatest icons sometimes shake with fear before the true meaning of existence. People will still remember Gene Hackman, not just because he was one of the greatest actors of all time, but because he was a symbol of the fragility hidden behind a tough exterior. A man who spent his life trying to escape the spotlight only to realize that the spotlight was the only thing that could save him from the darkness within.